In my high school, kids would quote Goodfellas like other kids quoted Star Wars. Okay, ready to go. Welcome back to the podcast, everyone. My name is Mike Perrine. This is the Everyday Detox podcast, and on this episode, I'm going to take you through a little storytelling journey about 4 of the most influential people in my life that have influenced my life greatly, my work greatly. And when I say 4 most influential people, I mean people outside of the home. Obviously, my mother and my father have been the most influential people in my life. My children, but my wife. But I mean people outside of my family life that have deeply, deeply influenced me. Before we do that, real quick, if you have not yet subscribed to this podcast, it would be tremendously helpful. It really helps out when you subscribe to the podcast. If you have a moment and you can leave a review if you get value from these podcasts, that would be fantastic. And if you watch these podcasts on YouTube, if you can subscribe to the channel and like the video, all of this tells the platforms and algorithms that this is something valuable or entertaining or funny or whatever it is. And it recommends it to more people based on that. So that's a great way that you can help support this podcast. And if you really want to go a step further and support this podcast, go down to the show notes or the description, and you can visit us at Everyday Detox Academy and check out our master classes on deep tissue cleansing and living the cleansing life. Also, you can click the link below and use the code to buy some Vilasta astaxanthin, because if you're going to support this podcast, you should get something valuable in return. And Vilasta astaxanthin is the most potent antioxidant that you can take in supplement form. If you haven't checked out the podcast I did with Sam Shepard, you can check out that podcast. You can watch it on YouTube or listen on any of the podcast apps. It's one of the best ones I've ever done, and I truly believe in that product, and that's why I promote it. So anyway, let's go on this little storytelling journey. This is going to be a fun one for me. When I was about 18, 19 years old, I was really kind of in a dark place. I was a very young father and trying to fit into the new responsibilities of life. My oldest child is, let's see, where are we? He is 32 years old right now. So I had a child very young. I was 15 when he was born. And I had a lot to process. And I also grew up in New York in the 80s and 90s where there was a lot of bad influences. My family was amazing, but the influences outside of the home, I sort of gravitated towards those. And there was a lot of drugs and alcohol and cigarette smoking. I mean, kids would start smoking at like 11, 12 years old where I'm from. I started smoking at around that age. I did see, because it was the 80s, I was born in the 70s, but because it was the 70s and 80s, like I did see even the good people of my family, like sitting around smoking cigarettes, having drinks, eating lots of indulgent foods. So like I kind of had that messaging too, because that's what everybody did back then. I remember sitting at my Nana's house on a Sunday, and all the Italian food would come out. And then, after dinner, everyone would be playing cards around the table. My dad and all his brothers and their wives and my grandparents, and everyone was smoking at the table, big cloud of smoke, and everyone was having dessert and coffee and, having drinks. And, I'd be sitting in front of the TV, just watching something, some movie or something like that. And I used to eat Cool Whip out of the container. I didn't realize that Cool Whip wasn't ice cream. Sometimes it would make me really sick. But, so like the whole processed food thing, smoking cigarettes, people just drinking, like this was part of the culture back then. So I had that messaging. Then I had all the kind of dark stuff that was happening as I started to venture out of the home and get a little more independent. And I went right into alcohol culture very deeply. So I was drinking at a young age as well, and alcoholism runs in my family. And I had some problems with addiction. And I mean, by the time I was 18 years old, I should have been at my prime. And I was probably at the worst shape ever that I was in my entire life. I was about 60 pounds heavier than I am now. And I was making a lot of bad decisions. And I was just trying to, I was trying to exist in that world. And, in that process and I would drink a lot. So as a teenager, I would do a lot. I would do like drinking like 6 to 7 days a week sometimes. And it wasn't just like, an adult's alcohol problem that would have like some, too much wine or have wine every night. And, like it wasn't that. It was low quality garbage alcohol that I could afford, smoking 1 to 2 packs of Marlboro Reds a day. I used to drink, a lot of malt liquor, Old English. When funds got tight, I would drink Midnight Dragon, which is a disgusting malt liquor, a cheap, disgusting one. Sometimes, of course, we drink like Budweiser and those kind of beers or whatever anybody had. A lot of keg parties out where I lived. Sometimes I would drink something called Schlitz, which is exactly how it sounds. I think it was like $6.99 for a 30 pack. So you see the quality drop right there. I used to drink a lot of vodka. And I was really polluting myself. And at a certain point, like every once in a while, I'd kind of just be too hungover and sick to go out. So I was, bouncing around my parents' house late one night, and I went into their basement, and they had all these books, just like all the stuff people accumulate in their house. And I don't know, I need to ask my parents whose book it was. I actually don't know whose book it was, but there was a book sitting there amongst all these books, and I looked at it, and it was almost like a spiritual awakening, like something happened in that moment. And I don't know why. I mean, thinking back, I can create a story around it. I know why I was drawn to it, because I needed it. But it was a very intimidating book. And I'm going to show it to you here. You'll see it on YouTube in a second. Little paperback, small print. And it was about a very intense story about a very serious man. And I said, I need to read this book. And this is the first person it's the reason I have this podcast. It's the reason I take my life so seriously. It's the reason why I showed up to parent and be a father to my first child at such a young age, like in a big way. It's the reason why I got my shit together, why I started educating myself. I was so deeply moved by his life. And it's not someone that a lot of people expect to set someone off on this path. But that person was Malcolm X. It was the autobiography of Malcolm X. And I have it right here. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll see it. If not, I show this on social media sometimes. So you can either, if you're listening to this, you can drop it on YouTube, or you can take a look on my social media pages. But I have it here. You see it's in a case. It's in a case with a glass cover on it. And this is the original printing, I believe. And this is the copy that I picked up. And obviously it's a very, very precious book to me. And it means so much to me that I keep it here in a case. It's held together by rubber bands. I read it almost 30 years ago, and I don't recall. I actually meant to look up the date on this podcast, on the printing of this book before. I don't want to open this up, but I was going to Google it and just try to figure out when this first printing was made. But this could be a 50-year-old book. I don't know exactly how old this book is, but it was 30 years when I read the book, and it's falling apart at the seams. And I picked up this book, and, yes, I was inspired by Malcolm's life. And I mean, he's a very powerful man. I mean, he's one of the first powerful males, I think, that I saw in my life. And my father was actually a very powerful male figure, but, he was my father. So I was more inclined to rebel against him. And also the things that my father did for the family, I couldn't connect to them because I hadn't done shit with my life, right? So like, the things he provided and the way that he worked and all the things that he provided for me, I would take that for granted. But looking externally at someone else, that was the first powerful male figure, because the people I looked up to before that, it's going to sound crazy. Well, this part's not going to sound crazy. There was a lot of rock stars. It was the 80s rock stars, the heavy metal stuff, a lot of the hip hop guys, because, right in the 80s metal was king, and then hip hop came around. And, so it was a lot of that indulgent kind of rock stardom, so I was getting a lot of the wrong messaging there. But also it was a lot of mafia guys. And you might be like, what? Like, what are you talking about? Well, I grew up in Staten Island, New York. And, the culture, I mean, in my high school, kids would quote Goodfellas like other kids quoted Star Wars. Like it was just part of the culture. I thought it was part of the world culture or the national culture. It's not, like it's very specific to where I grew up. I mean, we even had, I went to school with a lot of their children, and there was even books in our library, our school library, that had to be removed because they featured some of the parents of the children at the school. So anyway, a lot of this was from the popular culture of the movies at the time, things like Goodfellas. And, so these were the male figures that I was looking at. And it was all the wrong messaging. And then I looked at Malcolm's life, and yes, he was a powerful male role model in that regard. But the thing that really sticks with me, because there's a lot of, obviously you read a book like that, you look at someone's complex life like that, there's so much there. But the thing that I really learned from it was self-responsibility. And I still talk about that to this day in my messaging to clients. And when it comes to food or fitness or how you show up to your family or whatever it is, a lot of people are not self-responsible. And with the way that they worked with that, with the way Malcolm worked with that and the Nation of Islam worked with that, was that at the time when everything was unfolding in his life, there was this understanding that, yes, we've been victimized on an individual level, perhaps by the culture at large, of course, African Americans in the United States, but we're not going to be victims, and we're going to be self-responsible, and we're not going to drink their liquor, and we're not going to fall into these traps, and we're going to take responsibility and educate ourselves and live a clean life. And, these aren't things specific to me and, being a white male, but the lessons were very clear. And I was very impressed by it. And I thought that is such an intelligent and brilliant way to show up to a climate like that of racism and oppression, and like, what a powerful way to move through that. And that's why he was such a powerful figure. And I started applying that to my own life. And in reflection, as looking at how everything, all the adversity and everything that Malcolm faced, being in prison, being black in America at really one of the worst times in history, and how he worked through that and became a powerful, self-aware, self-responsible person. I realized, I'm like, look, dude, you're a white male in America and you're drinking your life away. You're being a little brat. You're not taking care of your child. You're not, like, you need to get your shit together. And so it was inspiring from there. And I really learned that self-responsibility part. And I started modeling him. And I would, first thing I did is I stopped eating pork. I wasn't trying to be Muslim or anything like that. I just, young man, I thought Malcolm knows what he's doing. I'm going to do that. I also started rewriting the dictionary because that is something that he did in prison. And I started studying all that I could. And I wanted to, my body was in bad shape and I wanted to eat better. And I didn't know really anything, at that time at 19 years old. But I started reading like men's health journals and, things that would just kind of come my way and come in the mail. And I was like learning about how to eat better. And there was this little nugget of knowledge that I thought that I had. A lot of people in my social circle were drinking soy milk because veganism was a big part of the New York hardcore movement. And I think probably nationally, maybe even worldwide, part of like a lot of that music scene. Vegetarianism and veganism somehow made its way in there, and animal rights. So I had friends that were into that, and they had recommended some things in books. It didn't really make sense to me. I was like, oh, okay. And I knew it was part of the scene, and I was part of that music culture and part of that music scene. But I thought to myself, well, I've been told that cholesterol is bad. Now we know cholesterol is much more, sort of nuanced, and we know that it's a little more complex than it was once understood just, 30 years ago. But I thought, oh, cholesterol is bad. Soy milk has no cholesterol. I'm going to go get some soy milk. Like, that was just my thinking. So I went to my local health food store. And I don't recommend as a practitioner soy milk to people these days or anything like that. But that was like my first step. And when I went to this health food store, I stood in front of the book section. And I still remember the day standing there and seeing a book that popped out to me that was recommended by my friend Matt. And I thought, I should start reading these books on diet and its relationship to disease and all of these things. And the book was called Diet for a New America. And again, if you're watching this on YouTube, I'm going to hold it up now. And this is a book by a man named John Robbins. And John Robbins was the heir to the Baskin-Robbins ice cream company. And I had the privilege of meeting him once. I really became involved in everything he was doing. His organization, EarthSave, I read every book that he's ever written. And yes, Diet for a New America. And he wrote another one called May All Be Fed. It's this book right here, another fantastic book. And these are very well documented books, by the way. A lot of references to Lancet and the American Medical and the Journal of the American Medical Association. So these aren't just philosophical books about things. And yes, they were written, I think May All Be Fed was written in like 91 or something, and Diet for a New America, I think, was the 80s. So I'm sure there's been revisions and there's more updated information. But these books and his work taught me the relationship between diet and disease, pesticide residues and poisons accumulating through the food chain, and the treatment of animals and how poorly and horrifically they were treated in factory farms. Things I never really gave a lot of thought to. So, 19 years old, I'm college age. My mind is blown wide open, right? I'm already fired up because of the lessons I've learned from Malcolm X. And I'll make it sound simple. I stopped drinking. I stopped smoking. I learned a lesson. You always, and it's been 30 years I've been sober. I haven't had a cigarette or alcohol or anything like that in about 30 years, maybe 29 or something like that. But getting close on 30 years. And you always have to stop drinking before you stop smoking. That's my advice there. Because if you're still drinking and you haven't smoked for 2 months, 3 months, and then you go out and have a night and start drinking, chances are you're going to have another few cigarettes and start that cycle over again. At least that's the way it was for me. And I still have a great friend who really helped me through that period. I'm actually wearing a shirt right now, if you're seeing this on YouTube. James Rizzi, you may recognize this artwork because he painted some murals in my studio, Vitality New York City, which is no longer Vitality New York City. Big long story because of the pandemic and whatever. It's now called Alivio Wellness, and one of my dear friends and previous business partners owns it, and she's doing a great job. But when it was my studio, he did the murals on the wall for that studio. So you may have seen them in previous podcasts if you've watched the videos. He's a very famous artist these days. He's done so well for himself. I'll put a link down in the description if anyone's interested in getting some of his clothing or you're interested in seeing his artwork. You can check him out. But he would sit with me. I mean, we've been friends since high school. And he would sit with me in diners on Fridays and Saturday nights, right? Because I was trying to stay away from the bar culture and the parking lot culture and the alcohol culture in the youth, in the youth culture out in Staten Island. And he would sit with me. He's very introspective young man, really appreciating art, and he would read a lot of books and a lot of Bukowski and things like that. And we would talk about these things, and we would talk about girls and life and all this stuff. And we would drink coffees, and I used to fill them up with half and halves, and we would drink them all night and chain smoke cigarettes, and it kept me away from alcohol. And we had a lot of good nights, and it was a really good time for me to be doing that, even though I was just in the first steps of cleaning things up. I'm still chain smoking cigarettes and pounding coffee at 2:00 in the morning in a diner, but it was exactly what I needed, and it was exactly the friendship that I needed. So thank you, James. Thank you for that. I really appreciate it, and I love you. And where was I going with that? Oh, so I started to clean. I was in this place where I cleaned up my life of the substances, and the next part was food. So I learned these things about the relationship between diet and disease and how our food affects the world and how our food affects us. And reading these books, I mean, I was just young and ready to go, and I was vegan in like 48 hours. I was just like, okay, I'm vegan now, and that's it. I didn't really know what I was doing. I didn't know how to prepare food. I had no background in anything like that. I remember just boiling some like Uncle Ben's brown rice and pouring a can of chickpeas on top. And I was like, I'm eating clean, but like, I was like, this sucks. Like I didn't know how to season food. There was no internet. There was no, there wasn't, I mean, there were books on vegan nutrition, and there were books on, like written by vegan chefs, but it was few and far between. It wasn't like it is today with like, you go on Instagram, you do #vegan, boom, 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 and you get recipes all over the place. It wasn't like that. So I was trying my best. And in this process, I started to lose weight very quickly. I started to detox pretty hard. My skin started to break out. And there was a lot of improvement. I started to feel better, but there were cycles of detoxification that I didn't quite get yet. And that led me to go see Dr. Fred Bisci. And he's the third person that's been one of the most influential people in my life. And I'm very fortunate. He's from Staten Island. I'm from Staten Island. And I remembered in high school, a high school teacher went to see him and told us all about his visit. And he said, did you guys know that white flour is actually bleached? And he was telling us all these interesting things about nutrition that none of us had ever heard before. And I always remembered that. Now, I wasn't, lit up enough to go change my diet when he was telling us this when I was 16 years old. But I always remembered that there was this kind of progressive, thinking outside of the box nutritionist that would tell you some things that would blow your mind, because back in 1992, people weren't talking about this. There was nothing about plant-based. Nobody really talked about organics or anything, at least not to me. I mean, I'm sure in small circles and in health food stores this was a thing, but I wasn't part of that. And so I always remembered that, and I was kind of like, yeah, that's really fascinating. So here we are a couple of years later, and I wanted to get in touch with him. And my friend, James Rizzi, the artist, his father was a client of Dr. Fred Bisci, so I was able to get his number. And I went in to go see him for the first time. And Dr. Bisci now has a book. It's called Your Healthy Journey. I'll put links to all these things down in the description or in the show notes. But he has a book called Your Healthy Journey, and you can see him on a lot of my podcasts. He has now been a lifelong friend and colleague. I've known him for about 30 years now. I think the first time I walked into his office was 1995, something like that. So 28 years, something. And he's actually going to be developing a series of courses for Everydaydetox Academy as well, which is really exciting. He's I think he's 94, 95 years old right now. And he's ready to go too. He's like, let's do it. He wants to come out here to Oregon and see me. And we're going to probably film it right here in my studio. And we're going to do a series of courses. But anyway, so I met with Dr. Bisci. He put me on his intermediate diet program. He increased the volume of raw food, really got me into raw vegetable juicing. I was eating salads, and my detoxes got much more intense. And he explained to me, he said, this is a process. You have to understand this. So if you're not feeling well, if you're doing all the right things and you're not feeling well, and you're having skin eruptions or headaches or fevers and body ache, and your body's dropping weight very rapidly, maybe you have some intestinal disturbances, he's like, that's the process. Most people try to cure the cure. First thing they want to do is they want to get out of not feeling well. He goes, but you've initiated a process of stripping down, your body's breaking itself down of all that inferior garbage you put in. Yes, it's detoxing, but your cell structure is basically built on all that fast food and stuff that you ate, and now you're eating seaweed and steamed tempeh and quinoa and salads and drinking carrot juice, and he's like, this is radically different than anything you've ever had, even from childhood. So your body's going to strip itself down, then it's going to rebuild itself with all of these superior building blocks. He said, so you don't want to cure the cure. You're in a process. You need to see yourself through on the other side. And he was so right. And a lot of people panic when they first start to eat clean. Oh, I dropped too much weight, or I don't feel good, and it's too much, And yes, that's what my work is these days. We transition through that to make it a little more smooth and to make it more effective. And yes, there's a lot of expert advice that can be given in that category. But in the early days, I didn't know any of that stuff. I didn't know anything about cleansing practices. I mean, saunas were for people on Wall Street cutting deals in the health club. Massages were stuff that people did as I don't know, some type of vacation getaway. You go get massages as a couple or something like that. These weren't things that people I knew did. So I didn't even know that much, colonics, infrared saunas, cold plunging, doing something like a liver flush. No. That wasn't even part of the vocabulary, but eating well was, and understanding the detox process was. So I was educated by Dr. Bisci with that. And things got very intense for me, and he coached me through that. And just understanding that process. I eat less food now and cleaner now and lighter now than I did, 25 years ago. And I have more weight on my body. I feel better than I did then. But when I first started, it was a little bit wow, I'm starting to look really good. My skin's shining, my eyes brightened up, everything's good, but I feel like I'm dying sometimes over here. And then understanding that you're in a process that you need to see through, that was priceless to me. So he's been a tremendous influence in my life. And for years, I've been able to I've had him on my podcast. I've been able to have him as a mentor and ask him questions, and for various clients I'm working with or things going on in my own life. And I'm so grateful for that. So grateful. And then years later, when the raw food movement really started to pop, when David Wolfe wrote the Sun Food Diet Success System and everyone was goji berrying themselves, goji berries and all this bullshit, and I started to up the raw food part of it. I didn't understand that there was a raw food element to all of this. So I started learning that, and I'm about 7 years into it now. And I've done a lot of work. I went to school as a natural food chef. I was working in restaurants. I was working at the amazing Angelica Kitchen. By the way, Leslie McKieran, the owner, she's been on the podcast as well. The owner of Angelica Kitchen was also a tremendous influence in my life. And just that, I can tell stories about how that restaurant affected me and my outlook and my approach to everything. That was one of the... Angelica Kitchen was like high school for me in a lot of ways. It feels like when I used to go back there, it was like a homecoming. I learned so much working there. But so I was trained as a natural food chef. I had done a lot of self-work. I had read all the books. I'd read all these books, and I had worked with Dr. Bisci. I had seen him multiple times for nutritional counseling. And then the raw food movement started to pop. And in about 1999, I started to increase my level of raw food. I learned that there was something called raw foodists. What is that? And it turns out there was a book that was published by Paul Nissan called The Raw Life. And in that book, there were all of these sort of iconic raw food people. And Dr. Fred Bisci had been the oldest living raw foodist in the Western world. I had no idea. And he didn't want to tell people that. He told me because he didn't want to be ostracized in the scientific community as like some sort of radical fringe person. He wanted his ideas around nutrition to be accepted by that community. And he didn't want to sound radical. That was in the early days. But now by 1999, 2000, he's now being interviewed in Paul Nissan's book. And another person was in that book, a man named Gil Jacobs. And someone I was with needed to get some colonics. She had some constipation issues. And she said, will you come with me to this thing? I'm getting this colonic. My therapist recommended I go to this guy. She says he's a little eccentric, but he's a sweetheart. And he really knows his shit, pun intended. And would you come with me? I said, yeah, okay, let's go. Go up to this luxury high-rise building up in Midtown Manhattan. And she's getting a colonic. And the guy goes, hey, kid, you don't have to wait out in the waiting room. You just come on in here with us. Okay. Now I'm watching a colonic suddenly. Starts talking to me. He's like, you got a vibe, kid. He's like, what's your deal? And I said, oh, well, I know Dr. Fred Bisci. He's like, oh, I'm from Staten Island too. I know him. Now, the person I'm talking about is Gil Jacobs. And Gil is 65 now. I am 48 now, and Fred is 94 now. So, we have all these spaces between us. Gil and I actually went to the same high school, obviously 20 years apart. And immediately, like now we're both from Staten Island. We're talking about the work. I'm telling him I'm into clean eating. So he's already interested. And he's like, okay, cool. Because Gil loves to talk this stuff, And even though I was new to colonics and the space, I wasn't new to like the language of the cleansing life. So we were having cool conversations. And then I said, Gil, I said, I'm like, eating cleaner these days. I said, I'm doing so much better than I was at 19 years old. I don't remember how old I was at this point, but it's like about 7 years later or something, or maybe young. Maybe it's about 5 years later. And I said, I'm doing so much better. I said, but I read these books. I should be like Superman. I should really like have this elevated level of vitality. And I don't always have that. And I was thinking maybe I should go back to eating some fish or eggs or something. Nah, kid. You just need to take a really big shit. We're getting you on the table next. I think he like bumped a client or something to get me on. I don't remember if it was that day or if I'm just muddling up the facts in my head. But shortly after, I'm on the treatment table. And I'm getting colonics now. And I really started to put it together. Not on the first, second, or third treatments, but as time went on, the way I would feel getting off the table, talking to Gil, watching the transformations of people in the waiting room, some with advanced diseases, getting great success, from the cleansing life and the treatments. Some people just going through major lifestyle shifts and losing tremendous amounts of weight and cleaning up their lives, and going from people that were completely, had a collapsed consciousness, poison, that had an epiphany, and suddenly they're getting involved in the cleansing life and they're doing the treatments, and now all of a sudden they're lifting this fog off of themselves, they're losing the weight, they're suddenly becoming vibrant, healthy people. And I'm going, wow, this is a real vibe here. And everyone in the office that was sort of eating like I was, the therapists, had elevated vitality. Like Gil is one of the most vital people I've ever met. And I was like, this is interesting. And Gil said, look, I know I was working as a natural food chef, and I would read all the books and do all the things. And he said, look, I know that you want to study nutrition. I wanted to be like Dr. Bisci and be a clinical nutritionist, and I wanted to sit across from people and, coach them nutritionally. Health coaching wasn't a thing yet, so I was going to go to a nutrition program. There was no nutrition programs that taught this. I asked Dr. Bisci at one point, I said, what school should I go to? He goes, anyone that'll give you a diploma. He goes, you're going to be writing in school. He goes, you're going to be writing school lunch programs, and you're going to be doing all this kind of USDA food pyramid stuff. He goes, that's what they teach. He goes, it's not worthless. He goes, but you're going to really have to read between the lines to pick and cherry pick the things that you're going to use in your own practice. He goes, because this information about the cleansing arts and plant-based nutrition, like that wasn't a thing back then. So you had to know somebody that understood this. And Dr. Bisci knew it well. He'd been involved in it for decades before he even met me. He goes, you need to know this. And he would always say, have your own experience. Make sure you live it. Don't tell people to do things that you haven't done or you wouldn't do. So Gil said to me, he goes, I understand that you want to study nutrition. He goes, that's great. He goes, but I'm going to tell you something. He goes, antioxidants and enzymes and phytochemicals and all the nutritional minutia. He said, that is like 20% of it. He goes, that's important. He goes, but 80% is elimination. 80% is shitting, sweating, and pissing. He's like, you need to get that down. He goes, if you're going to help someone, he goes, if their channels of elimination are not open, it doesn't matter. He didn't use these words, but basically he was saying, it doesn't matter how many pills you take and turmeric you sprinkle all over somebody, how many goji berries you eat. He used to make fun of the goji berries, honestly. He used to call them glorified raisins. But it doesn't matter how many goji berries you eat, how much turmeric you sprinkle all over yourself. He goes, if those channels of elimination are not open, it's spitting in the wind. And he was right. And I realized, I thought, you know what? I thought I can Gil nutritionally coaches right on the treatment table. I said, I already know a lot of this stuff. I can continue to study nutrition. I said, but I can really affect the chemistry of someone's body doing a colonic. And I kind of forced myself on Gil. I was like, Gil, I want to work with you. And I thought it was going to be a little bit of a process with Gil. I thought he was going to be like, well, okay, let's see how you do. And I was like, Gil, I want to work with you. And he's like, okay. I was like, oh, okay. I mean, Gil was like Tony Robbins to me. I was like, you don't just walk up to a guy like this and be like, I want to be part of your crew. But I was like, I want to be part of your crew. He's like, all right. And then I went to the school and I came back. And I was like, Gil, I'm trained. I'm ready to go. And he was like, wait, what? And they had to make room for me. Gil, I kind of forced myself on him. I was like, I'm ready to go. And it was, and I'll tell you something, I tell people I'm trained by Gil Jacobs, and obviously I am. He's done tons of treatments on me, and I've watched him do treatments, and I used to go to all of his lectures back when people used to do things in person, live events, and I worked with him for years. We've owned studios together. However, my training with Gil was so funny because I had a test subject, someone to work on, and it was my first time, and I was nervous, and I was putting the tubes and stuff on wrong, and he's like, you better fix that tube, kid, you better. And I'm thinking he's going to impart this deep knowledge and technique onto me, right? And I get it all set up, and I start running the water, and the phone rings. And, cordless phone, 2001, 2002, or whatever. He walks out there, he picks it up, he comes back in. And he's the person he's talking to on the phone. He goes, hey, what's up, woman? How you doing? And it's some friend of his. And he peeks in the room and he goes, you better pulse that tube, kid. And he walks out. That was the end of my training. I mean, I think he came in a couple more times over the course of these test ones. But I really, I picked up Gil's technique. I used to mirror it perfectly. And then I learned my own technique. And I do something completely different. Now, as any therapist will do, they're going to find their own. They're going to find their own technique and all that stuff. But man, Gil teaching me that it was more about elimination than it was about the minutia of nutrition was so important. And it really affected it really affected the way that I approach the work and the way I approach my personal life and the things that I think are important for staying, vital and healthy. So, yeah, it's been a wild ride. Those four people, Malcolm X, John Robbins, Dr. Fred Bisci, and Gil Jacobs have just been tremendous for me. Obviously, never got to meet Malcolm X. Met John Robbins one time at a talk that he gave at a high school in Manhattan. And Dr. Bisci I've known, and Gil I've known for the longest time, and was able to had businesses with Gil, done all sorts of projects with Fred. We've done podcasts with both of them. Gil just released a masterclass at Everyday Detox Academy. Dr. Bisci will be working on one. We'll probably get it down in the spring, I would say, and then maybe get it up by the summer of this coming year. But yeah, it's been a wild ride. Anyway, guys, thanks for listening. That was good for me to tell that story and just to think back to all those great memories. And hopefully some of these books and these people and some of the work I've done with them, like at the Academy or the podcasts or whatever, will be valuable to you as well. Anyway, hope you're all well. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you guys on the next one.